My goal for the next 15 or 20 minutes is to really provide some examples of ways that policy and programs are already influencing soil health. And my primary focus will be in the ways in which they're doing that in a positive way. In other words, encouraging practices or systems that improve soil health, mostly because I'm just an optimist at heart. There are a couple of points, and Rob pointed one or two of these out that I'll come back to, where we also think of, what are policies and programs that at least in some instances have negative impacts on soil health. And that was one of, it came up, I think, in Wayne's earlier comments about the need to really take a deep dive in a lot of different levels of policy to figure out where those positive and negative effects are and reduce the negative and increase the positive. Rob already mentioned we've been working over the last year. I won't read the names off either. And as Rob mentioned, we are meeting tomorrow, and as I go through, I'll try to give a little indication. Rob mentioned that one of the things we will focus on tomorrow is different ways that we might address soil health within the context of the upcoming Farm Bill, whenever the final version of that Farm Bill, but the conversations around the Farm Bill are already happening. But there are some other ways that, if you broadly define policy, and I will in just a moment, if you broadly define it, that, that we can have impacts, and some of them may be easier pathways than trying to do a Farm Bill, a heavy lift on a Farm Bill, or at least a heavy lift on this Farm Bill. So defining our terms, maybe more literally, this is me defining my terms. In terms of policies, the obvious starting point would be pieces of legislation, and the most relevant one, but certainly not the only one, would be the Farm Bill, whether it's the current Farm Bill or the prospective Farm Bill, but also things like the Clean Water Act, other environmental legislation that might influence soil health, either positively or negatively. And this does encompass all levels of government. And so federal, certainly, but as was noted, state level, and in a lot of cases, if we want to try to start pushing the envelope a little bit about what might be possible, in my view anyway, it would be much more likely that we would see that level of innovation at the state level first, and then maybe bubble up to the federal level. It also, at least, and this is true of our action team that we've been working with, it's not just about government policy, it's also about kind of corporate policy or business models that encourage soil health. So it brings in a lot of issues around supply chains. I know there's a number of people here today that are certainly are concerned about that, and either already have plans in place as how they address that as a company or would like to make progress in that area. And also nonprofit organizations, and I'll give a few examples of these as we go along. So this really provides some authorization and structure about, okay, soil health is important, and then you have to think about what is it exactly that's going to happen, which is much more about implementation. And at the federal level, that would be, a Farm Bill authorizes something and sets a set of goals. So let's say it's a conservation goals, and then programs are developed specifically to try to go reach those goals. So in the conservation realm, coming out of I think the 96 Farm Bill was the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, which I'll spend a few minutes talking about. So these are much more action-oriented than the original legislation might be. These are really distinct, but are obviously influenced by advocacy, and that advocacy comes from a variety of different places, including a lot of the organizations and companies that you all are already doing your work with. So, and I'll talk a little bit about that toward the end. So there is a policy conundrum, or maybe a policy choice to be made around soil health specifically. And one of those is there or should there be a soil health policy? Maybe that's USDA, maybe it's multi-agency across federal government, et cetera, that really has at its core, or kind of its core value, that we need to better steward this particular natural resource, this soil resource on which we depend for our agricultural system. So that's one possibility. The other are policies and programs that impact soil health. And we've already heard a few examples of that from Rob. I will give you a few more in a minute. I would say that at this point in time, this is where most of the action is. And I guess my take on this would be that we should make some informed decisions about, do we want to move in this direction? Do we want to move from just how can we use current systems into something that is more comprehensive? Are we okay with having both of these at the same time, but also working on both? And that is one of the choices that we will make, and I'll hit on both of those a little bit as we go through. There are many definitions of soil health out there. I'll just use this one from NRCS about capacity of soil to function, having different functions, and these are examples of those. And as you might guess, there are many things, many activities that take place on farms and ranches that influence either these functions individually or collectively, and some of them are positive influences and some of them are negative influences. So there's no doubt at all that many of the programs that we currently live with at the federal and state level have direct impacts on soil health, positive and negative. EQIP would be an example of a program. Again, this is Environmental Quality Incentives Program. Most of you, I think, would be familiar with. So this is a cost share program with a bucket of money coming from federal, but also direct contributions by the farmer and rancher. So there's a buy-in there at the level of the farm and the ranch. And these are practice-based, so there are practice standards. There are many of them. If you've never looked at the list, I actually would encourage you to do that, and they are generally linked to specific resource concerns. So they're not system-based, like the Conservation Stewardship Program is much more a farm-level program. It's in the conservation title. It is conservation-focused, but obviously has an impact on soil health. But it does address multiple resource concerns, and one of those is soil. And we'll circle back to the soil aspect of this in a little bit. I'll give 3 examples of practices, just so you can kind of see the range. And in all of these, you could probably, with a little bit of effort, in the last case, it's a little bit of effort. In this case, it's maybe more effort. You could make a link to say, okay, well, this particular practice standard influences soil health. So this is agrochemical containment. So you can get cost share to develop one of these. So it's about containing primarily pesticides on a farmer or ranch during things like mixing and clean out and things like that. So, that containment has a valuable function in reducing environmental flow of those chemicals. And you could maybe with a bit of a stretch say that's a good thing in terms of soil health. But I think in my mind anyway, it would be a bit of a stretch. We've heard a number of times today about reductions in tillage, or in some cases elimination of tillage, so going to pure no-till systems. Very obvious and well-documented conservation impacts, so reduction in erosion and soil loss, and also movement of other things with soil and water, but also changes in soil carbon, changes in microbial community potentially. So you're getting closer to where you can see that link between them. And then certainly you have things like cover crops, and the emphasis on this shifting toward the idea that the greater proportion of time in a year that we have growing plants out there has obvious benefits. So this is like the no-brainer of the group, right? Where the more you do that, the healthier that soil is. So these are all practice standards out of EQIP, but to varying degrees, they have an influence. There would be you could pretty quickly come up with a list of maybe 5 or 7 practice standards out of EQIP that the implementation of those generally would have positive impacts, and we have the science base on which to rely for that. The priority setting, though, does take place at multiple levels. So even though EQIP is federal, the distribution of funds takes place at the level of states, and they set priorities. So specifically now thinking about soil health, this is just taken off the website of NRCS. soil health across the nation. If you haven't looked at this, it's a clickable map, so you can go and see what's happening in individual states around this. So NRCS, as we all know, has made a pretty clear commitment to the idea of improving soil health. There's no surprise there. And then these are just a couple of other examples. The one on your left, this is from South Dakota, so the Soil Health Initiative, and they had set priorities for South Dakota, which is appropriate, that states are not the same agriculturally, and they should be able to set priorities. So they were interested in the idea of closer linkages or better integration between crop and livestock systems within the Soil Health Initiative. And the one on the right, this is from NRCS New Jersey, was also Soil Health Initiative, but was really about setting a baseline. So being able to collect some relevant data, partly so that we can think about trajectory. Is soil health getting better or is it not getting better? So that kind of priority setting is already there. This is one of a number of opportunities where within existing policy and program, with potentially just administrative changes at the federal or state-federal interface, that we could move this forward by specifically prioritizing soil health within an existing program with now a 20-year history. An example of this is the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. Of course, I got my acronym wrong, but I was working on it yesterday. So this is an example actually from Missouri. So there are a lot of projects through RCPP out there, and this one is specifically focusing on aspects of soil health. And this is this program is very much a partnership. So it brings together state departments of agriculture, it brings together commodity organizations, et cetera, which is potentially another thing that we want to make sure is a consistent set of connections being made among the different sectors, if you will, government, private sector, nonprofit sector, as we pursue these goals in soil health. One that we haven't talked about very much today is Conservation Reserve Program, which has been around since the Farm Bill of 1985, so more than 30 years. Very different in tone, if you will, compared to EQIP. EQIP's a working land, so it's what are we doing for conservation and mitigation activities while still conducting agriculture or ranching. This more taking land out of production, but certainly documented gains in carbon sequestration. Now you're talking about more diverse perennial vegetation on millions of acres of land and vulnerable land, highly erodible land. And then the other ecosystem benefits that are associated with this, and particularly things like wildlife and pollinators and those types of things. So as characteristic of many policies and programs, you can make, I think, a very confident connection between soil health and the practice or the system, but recognizing that many of them are providing multiple benefits across different things. So it's protecting water quality, yes, but it's also improving soil health. Enhancements in CSP. So CSP is the Conservation Stewardship Program. Different from EQIP and different from CRP. This is a farm or ranch level. It's rather than being a cost share, it's more of a and practice based. It's more pay for performance. So it's what are the outcomes, and most or many would view kind of moving from EQIP with its practice focus and getting farmers and ranchers to move to CSP. So kind of graduated involvement with these particular programs. This is one, though, where soil health is really in there already. So these enhancements here, so this is an enhancement that's actually called soil health crop rotation. And so this is mostly in the context with annual cropping systems, but there are other enhancements that contain that descriptor of soil health, but they're more geared toward grazing systems and things like that. So it's already there, and I looked through the list a couple days ago, and there's somewhere between 15 and 20 enhancements that are addressing this concern, which is soil quality degradation, But the converse of soil quality degradation, I think, would be improving soil health. So if we change that trajectory, that's a good thing. So there are some things, and this is one of the topics that we'll be talking about, I think, in our group tomorrow morning, is within the context of CSP, where there's already an obvious statement that soil health is important, what kinds of changes in priority or changes in how the program is actually run allow us to further those benefits. And this is now, CSP is now kind of out there on the landscape on the order of about 80 million acres. So it is a big, big land base that we could make progress on. Of course, CSP also has other resource concerns embedded into the program that those enhancements are addressing. Research and outreach, we've heard about this a number of times today. Some of the research that we heard in the first session has obvious connections here. But also, you know, professional development and training for people in cooperative extension, for example, but also in, you know, for certified crop advisors or for other organizations that provide technical assistance and service directly to farmers and ranchers. That is an important function. Grants that go directly to farmers and growers and that stimulate the development of these collaborations are all a good thing. Student support in various ways. Certainly the SARE program, since its origins in the very late 80s to around 1990, has essentially had a continuous commitment to soil health. The organic program, the organic research program out of USDA also does, but what we're now seeing is significant interests and projects being funded through things like the AFRI foundational grants, and in some lesser number, the larger CAP grants that have at least very visible components of soil health. And as Rob pointed out, it's a policy choice to be made as to whether we try to scale that up and make soil health a bigger priority area within an existing research and education and extension structure that comes largely from USDA, but also from states. Soil health and crop insurance, Rob mentioned this. The question in my mind was, because I'm not only kind of a glass half full kind of person, I'm like a glass 80% of the way full. So you can, you know, do you want to talk about incentives or perverse incentives? Some would argue that there are aspects of crop insurance that are just, you know, leading to behaviors that and allocation of resources that are more risky, and then the outcome from soil health is negative. Or we could look at it as, what are the changes again? And this is the largest transfer to farmers and ranchers through crop insurance that provides incentives for those practices that we're very, very confident have positive impacts on soil health. The one that we've heard about again and again is cover cropping, but there would be, you know, it's a list that's, you know, certainly 5 or 10 that in almost every instance would bring us benefits. AGREE also took this kind of as a task force approach to look at the potential changes, and were quite specific in what they suggested. This group has been mentioned already. This is much more a targeted approach. So on that conundrum slide that I showed earlier, this is very much moving up to what we really need is a coordinated and strategic policy at the federal level that embeds soil health as a core principle. And then you have to think about what are the actions, what are the programs that do that. So very much a call to action there, as is this, Rethink Soil from the Nature Conservancy, both thinking about how do we make it big and great, but also bringing together a diverse range of partners that allow us to accomplish that. State initiatives, we're going to hear about these, so now I realize that, you know, we're going to have speakers that literally can like color in the diagram about California and Maryland starting in just a little while, and then we'll hear about Maryland later. Cindy Lair, who's on our action team, actually did an informal survey just asking states about their, what are they doing in states that specifically prioritizes soil health, and it's actually some decent news from that where, you know, for things like technical assistance, about half of the people that responded says, yes, we are specifically trying to expand our efforts in the area of soil health, so that's good news. I guess, so I'll close with just a couple of thoughts. One is, and we've heard about this in almost from every speaker today, is there is just this incredible range of interests that are now focusing on soil health. And this is just one example, Unlock the Secrets of Soil, the Soil Renaissance, certainly our hosts here, the Soil Health Institute, and really, you know, now being the moment, whether it's on the research side, the assessment side, education, policy, what have you, that this is one of the rare issues around agriculture and resource management that I can think of since my involvement began some in the early 80s, that people are looking at this like it'd be very hard to be in opposition to improving soil health, that everybody agrees it's important, and on the policy front, it's like, what are the steps that we think we should take to move that agenda forward? And it could be that we collectively, again, agree that, yep, we should make as many gains as we can within the existing structure, and at the same time, we should move toward a coordinated, strategic, national emphasis on this, which I would be perfectly thrilled with if we did both of those things. But I think we do need to continue to have that conversation, which we will. Rob and I are committed to selling and recruiting for our session tomorrow. At 8:20, thinking about what that looks like. And, you know, everyone in this room has contributions to make to that, and that's what it's going to take, is not just individual interests going and saying we think it's important. It's going to take something a lot louder than that. So with that, I will stop, and if we have time for questions, and certainly with Rob's expertise and experience, you can ask him questions too. Thank you.
Thanks. So I think, Wayne, we've got about 2 minutes for questions before we go to lunch, so 1 or 2.
So what would you say to a policy of zero tolerance for soil erosion?
I'll just repeat the question. The question was, what would I think of as policy of zero soil erosion? I mean, my first comment would be that erosion is geological, so it happens regardless. We did have a conversation in our group yesterday about thinking about either maybe setting more aspirational thresholds, if you will. So one of the common metrics is T, which is what we think of as a threshold for how much erosion can occur, and should we take that and then try to knock it way down? And then the policy choice becomes this. Do you try to achieve that with some kind of regulatory stick, saying, and then you have to think about, like, how do you monitor that on a continental scale or on the scale of an individual field on this farm, saying that that's eroding too much and now we're going to tell you what to do? Or do you continue, this is the basis for most USDA conservation programs, all of them, I think, do you continue to just provide an incentive to try to have farms and ranches move in that direction? And, you know, the fact is that we'll never get to zero erosion, because before humans were here and after we're gone, erosion was occurring. But that doesn't mean we can't knock that way down. And in some areas, geographic areas, we've made tremendous progress, and in other areas, in the US, but certainly globally, much less so. So we could be strategic about that. But then you're talking about, should we go into this area and really target this as our primary problem, which is soil loss?
You've talked quite a bit about the role of soil in agriculture, and yet if you tie agriculture, soil health to water quality issues, you also need to take into account issues with regard to the peri-urban environment and the urban environment. And so I'm just wondering about any type of policies that you're looking at with regard to, like within rural development programs to address the non-agricultural soils.
The initial part of your question, I thought you were headed toward what about the agriculture that occurs in those peri-urban areas and in fact in urban areas. And there's some going on in those areas. But there'd certainly be, my expertise and experience would certainly be within the agricultural realm. And once you get outside of that, so we're thinking about things that are happening in, you know, quote, natural environments that are not there. Right, right. That have many ecological functions. And I guess my short answer would be I'm not the best person to answer that. But there are things going on, but I'm just not sure what the policy triggers for those might be. It's a great question because, you know, our land base for agriculture, farming, and ranching in this country is relatively stable over a very long period, over a period of decades. But then there's all the other places that aren't farms and ranches, right? And what's the capacity there? So a wonderful question.
So how fast does legislature runs behind research to actually change the policy?
You mean in terms of the policy? Like, I mean, one that makes the assumption that all policy is really well informed by research. Maybe. But as I said, you know, there are certain aspects of what we've heard about today, both in practice, but also when Steve Schaefer was talking about things like Tier 1 measurements, and Keith Poston was talking about some of those aspects around carbon sequestration. There are some aspects of this that you can't really make a feasible argument that we don't know enough, right? The research base for some of this is really, it's deep and it's high quality. And then there is kind of the evolving science. And I guess my take on this would be we could move forward pretty hard on the things that we're sure about, and then we need to like continually go back and say, okay, with these frontier technologies or frontier science, like this is the cutting edge, we always circle back and say, okay, does that help us do a better job? So, but for some of this, it's, you know, the example that we've heard again and again is cover crops. It is a no-brainer. We know that it helps, and it helps soil health, if you will, but also just flat out as a conservation practice. So continuing to encourage the adoption of that is something that we just push forward with. Great. Thanks.
Okay, thanks again.
Very good.
Thanks, gentlemen.